So out of this demo, I showed you quite some operating system security protections. And you might go like, is there even more? Well, the good news is, yes, there is. What it means is in our next section, if you remember from the introduction, we're also going to zoom in a little bit more on what it really takes to secure hardening that Windows Server operating system. So just as a starting point, in this section, again, a few different items that I want to focus on. Starting with OS config, it's like a little capability in the platform, like a little bit of command line that's going to allow you to configure some settings, validating how secure your operating system already is. Then I guess the biggest one out of this section is the local admin password solution that's going to allow you to manage the passwords for local admin accounts. Talking a little bit about privileged access workstations, more about setting the scene, what's the concept like, without drilling down on all the details. And then last, closing with some highlights, how to secure domain controllers, specifically talking about the security compliance toolkit that you should integrate for all your servers. And then last, closing the SMB traffic for like file sharing if you should not need it, or maybe disabling the legacy supportability there. So with that, I would say let's jump in straight away. So the first one, OS config, it's that little tool that you have where it's going to allow you to define specific settings. So a few highlights here. As always, I like to start with auditing and reporting. Don't make any changes in your operating systems, whether it's server or clients, if you don't know the impact. So that's where you could validate what is the security state, what is the security compliance, and maybe configuration state of some of those settings. Next to that, drift control is where I would say it typically means that you're not always using automation. We're mainly pointing at what we describe here as desired state configuration. Now, if you think about configuring your servers, you might have a solution like System Center, Configuration Manager, maybe some PowerShell on top of it. Maybe you're using some other non-Microsoft products to really integrate your servers. But then at some point, you might lose a little bit of that overall view on what is the configuration of my servers like, and actually finding out that one server might be fully patched, might be fully up to date, might have specific settings where you could assume that all your web servers in this example should have the same settings, but then finding out that that's not actually the case. So that's another benefit out of that OS config tool. A few other ones here, but again, I'm not going to read everything from slide. Just know that the tooling is there, that you can run it, and obviously integrating it in like a PowerShell, integrating it with policies could be another one. Or even if you deploy servers using like a DevOps pipeline approach, you could actually integrate the tasks from there as well, relying on that little OS config little tool. More important, I would say, is the LAPS, or Local Administrator Password Solution. Now, LAPS has been around for multiple years, but it's actually quite recently been updated. Now, in short, it's still doing the same thing. So what's the baseline of LAPS? If you have administrator accounts, you probably know that you have the domain admins, like those are the admin users that are available throughout all devices, clients and servers across the domain or across multiple domains. But now you also need a local admin account on each and every client workstation. And that's where you used to have some challenges, like what about passwords? What about managing those accounts? And that's really what LAPS is about. It's going to allow you to keep those local admin passwords, but now synchronizing them, storing them if you want, in an Active Directory as some sort of a backup. Next to that, when we talk about Active Directory, when we talk about backup, no surprise that those passwords are also encrypted. It's nothing really new. Obviously, each and every password on each and every client and server is obviously protected, encrypted within the operating system. But now this local password is also stored encrypted in Active Directory. On top of that, each and every of those local admin passwords are now also unique on each and every computer. Now, again, I have no idea about each and every of your scenario setups, but I remember, like again, years ago, when I deployed servers in on-prem scenarios, like on-prem data centers, servers, and clients, it was always I would say, a little bit of a challenge like, oh, what's the local admin password? And just to make it easy, we would come up with a somewhat more complex password, but then also having it identical on all machines. Now, if you think about like, okay, but what's the actual problem there? Well, the thing is like with, again, anti-malware solutions, once the anti-malware tool, like a cyber attack, right, is capable of hacking into one machine, if all those passwords for all those user accounts, the local admins are the same on all machines, guess what's going to happen with your environment? Yes, exactly right. All those machines are now becoming quite vulnerable. Or maybe you're not even able of managing those devices because out of that cyber attack, somebody already changed all those passwords. So that's, I would say, one of the side effects why you should enable it. Now, in short, how does it work? And obviously, you can imagine I got a little demo coming up on this part. So in short, there's like three main steps. Step number one, your LAPS is going to determine the password for the local admin. Like, is the password still active? Is it expired? If it's not expired yet, then nothing's going to happen. It's that local admin account, it's the local password, and I'm not going to touch it. But then if the password got expired, that's where LAPS is going to step in and performing a few different tasks. So first, it's going to force a new password. So you're not even, as a user or an admin, you're not even really involved in all that, based on a random value, obviously like creating some super secret, super secure string based on the parameters that you can control. Like what is the password complexity? What is the number of characters that we need? And I would say, obviously, try to use the same guideline from the previous section. Complex password policies are quite relevant. And then from there, you're going to implement it. You can see here, teasing a little bit to the auditing piece, where you're going to enable it for a different or a specific organizational unit. And then preferably, since we like automation every now and then, right, you're going to use that set LAPS ADC computer self permission. And that's where you define which of the user and computer account groups will benefit from the LAPS capability. I would say enough on that on the slides. Let's jump to yet another demo where I'm going to walk you through some parts of the configuration. So the starting point for this next demo on local administrator password solution is downloading the actual LAPS tool. So just do a quick search for local administrator password solution or LAPS Microsoft, and you're going to find it here. Or if you pause the video, you can pick it up from here as well. After the download, the idea is to run the install. I'm doing this on my domain controller, but technically this would be your admin workstation where you do have the group policy tools installed as well. Pretty straightforward from here. We accept the license agreement, and then here I'm just going to show you that we will install everything because we need GPO updates, and I can show you a bit in the management interface as well. So we click next, install, only takes like a couple of seconds, and that's pretty much it. From here, we jump into our group policies where I already created an empty group policy, so nothing defined in here, where now we can start editing it. So the policy itself lives in our domain, computer configuration, policies, and then administrative templates. Now what we have here, thanks to that install, is a new section for LAPS specifically. So without the install, you won't even see it. But again, you don't have to run this from a domain controller. Once we have our LAPS, we can start enabling or configuring overall what policies we want. So from here, just gonna make this a little bit bigger. We can define specific password policies. So you could change this to obviously a lot more complex passwords. So we're gonna enable it, and password length, I don't know, these days could be like at least 20, and then maybe the age, like 30 would be acceptable. We could also integrate other settings like name of the administrator account to manage. That would be like admin user or something. In our case, that's the specific user account, and then also enable local administrator account management. We're going to enable that as well. And then if you want, you can again play with some of these settings to do not allow password expiration. Now, next to that, once everything is configured, we could now open up the LAPS user, searching for our MSCS sample computer. And as you can see here, it cannot be found. Like, the reason behind this is because I did not force my group policies to update, because I need my domain controller for a few other scenarios. But what it would allow you to do here is really connecting to an individual computer. It's going to show you the updated password and then also some information about the expiration, and you can change some of those settings as well. So this was, in short, what I wanted to show you: how to install the LAPS tool, how to define the group policy settings, and then a little bit on the LAPS UE or user interface to validate some of those settings. So with that, let's move back to the presentation. Good. So with that, we can cross off another security optimization in our server environment, local admin password solution. But we're not done yet. There's even more security optimization possible, and that's stepping out a little bit from protecting your operating system itself, but thinking about how do you actually manage your environment. What I'm talking about here is the concept of privileged access workstations, or PAWs. Now, what is a PAW? It's basically a dedicated virtual or physical workstation that you're going to use to manage your clients, to manage your servers, to manage your applications. So it's a dedicated machine, preferably. It's not your day-to-day workstation that you use as a user, and maybe not even a dedicated one that you're going to use for all your administrative tasks. Now, there's a lot of variations there, and I've seen a whole bunch of them throughout the years, where sometimes you have like your day-to-day administrative user account logging onto your laptop, let's say, and within the laptop, you somehow turn it into that privileged access workstation. I would say that's not really what we recommend. Another scenario is, for example, where you have your day-to-day laptop where you're going to use it for checking emails, maybe doing some day-to-day office work, and then inside the workstation or inside the laptop, it could be a desktop as well, right? Inside, you're going to run a virtual machine, and that virtual machine is now becoming your privileged access workstation. It's a little bit better, but at the same time, since it's a virtual machine running inside the host, also make sure that your host is obviously ultimately protected. So that's where before I talked about a dedicated machine, which could be a virtual machine on a hypervisor, a like scenario. Maybe later on you might run it in Azure. But then at the same time, you might think about like, how should I manage my Azure environment if my privileged access workstation is actually running in Azure? So you might even consider having a different scenario, keeping it a little bit closer to the admin, right? And then using that to authenticate and get into your server backend. Whether it's cloud or on-prem doesn't really matter at that moment in time. A lot of security optimization recommendations here. Obviously, the first one, the obvious one, make sure that not everyone can authenticate from that access workstation. Only authorized users should be able to use it. Enable all possible Defender security mechanisms that I already talked about before, which means Defender Credential Guard, which means app control, which might mean installing Defender endpoints or maybe using a third-party tool, but then at least I would say the Defender for endpoint if you're not using anything else. BitLocker drive encryption, I always smile when I see that on a slide, because to me it feels like, is anyone not using BitLocker by default? But just a little reminder, you could say. Defender Device Guard is popping up here as well. And then obviously try to avoid connecting that machine to the internet. Next to that, all admin tools that you might need to manage your environment, whether it's on-prem running applications, maybe cloud-based applications, make sure that you got the latest versions, the most up-to-date patched versions, to avoid any security vulnerabilities. And then preferably also limiting physical access, if that's possible, out of your environment. And then this one here is moving on how you could bring in some additional security, like blocking RDP. And that's where, again, the virtual machine concept would be okay from your host, like, again, a laptop, into the virtual machine, but then maybe not running it on a virtual machine backend host. If you don't have another means to connect to it using RDP. Why not? Because RDP is still not always considered a secured way to connect to your workstations. Where possible, try to manage your environment using remote admin tools, using PowerShell, because you typically are not just managing one aspect of a workload or a server or an application, but probably jumping from one backend server to other. And that's where automation with PowerShell could again be recommended. I think that's pretty much it, apart from the last one here, where it's again highlighting what's the benefit or maybe the watch out between that daily user workstation, like my day-to-day office job, and turning it into a privileged access workstation, maybe using the host and virtual machine, and then deciding what would be the best approach. You can do this with different tools later in one of my other demos. I'll talk about Windows Admin Center, which is like a browser-based scenario, allowing you to really manage your server environment and even later on interacting from it with different Azure capabilities. So that could be another mechanism that you could use as well. More security with securing domain controllers. We talk about domain controllers in Azure 800 quite a lot. It means it's the server or probably multiple servers that you use to host Active Directory domain services. No matter what kind of workload you're running in your environment, whether it's on-prem or maybe in cloud, domain controllers are the most critical servers in your environment. What I mean by that is that all your credentials, the SIDs, the security identifiers, as we call them, are all stored and based on that Active Directory domain. Whenever you join a client or a server to the domain, you're going to create that trusted relationship between the client and the server, between client server and the domain controllers. And as you know, in meantime, they're also responsible for handing out and validating the user credentials. So you need to, I would say, overprotect, maybe ultimately protect your domain controllers from any possible cyber attacks, any possible authentication from a user, an admin preferably, that should not be able to authenticate. And that's really what these 2 or 3 slides that I have on the topic are actually highlighting. So just emphasizing a few of these. First of all, make sure that preferably run the latest or at least up-to-date operating system for your domain controllers. Now, if you think about, well, Peter, we're still running server 2016, 2019, because it's not all that easy to migrate, to upgrade, know that out of this AZ-801, we do have a dedicated module on migration, where one of the touching points on migration is upgrading the in-place operating system, which actually works quite well in meantime, but also migrating from one machine to another. And that's where maybe migrating Active Directory could be one of the so many possible workloads that you want to migrate. Another touching point is deploying domain controllers on what we call that server core, which means it's like the stripped down version, not having the full graphical interface, and then again, allowing you to do that remote management. If possible, use that physically secured environment. So make sure that it's in, if it's a physical server, it's in the data center, it's not running somewhere in like a little office space under a desk. Yes, I've seen those scenarios in the past. I just hope that that's not the case anymore nowadays. If you're running virtual domain controllers, then obviously make sure that all possible security mechanisms are put in place for the physical host, and then as much as possible also for the virtual machines running on top of it. And then last, integrate that TPM security chip, allowing you to use full encryption, BitLocker, and everything that you probably already know about what it takes to really secure your environments. A few more precautions, but nothing really new here. install Defender, enable Defender device guard, enable Defender for endpoints. Like again, all security precautions I already talked about before are obviously valid for all kinds of servers, and maybe even more so, super valid for your domain controllers. Limit RDP connections, and I would almost personally say, like, just don't do RDP to servers, but I also know that every now and then you need that exception, but just try to limit it as much as possible. Block internet connection, I hope that's a given, and obviously block also all other network traffic to and from the domain controllers, apart from what it needs to have enabled to obviously do the domain controller purpose task. That's the main thing. Now, if you think about, okay, I get it, but how do I manage all this? But also, how do I validate all this? That's where we have our Microsoft Security Compliance Toolkit, or the CST as we typically call it. So what is this Security Compliance Toolkit? It's out of the Microsoft product teams together with the compliance teams. We created some sort of a database, and it's mainly group policy settings that you can enable. A set of tools allowing you to validate, like, what is the security baseline that my operating system is using. It's not just for domain controllers. I know it's sometimes a bit confusing when we jump from domain controller security into this topic, but it's for all kinds of server operating system versions, first of all. And next to that, it's not just about the server, but there's also options to help you identifying how to make your Exchange server, make your SQL database server, make your IIS web server compliant, and at least getting all those details. Technically, how do we do that? First of all, you start with running a policy analyzer. It's going to validate what are the settings, what are the group policies for this specific organizational unit, maybe for a specific client or server, because you could also apply the compliance toolkit for clients, but we're mainly talking about servers here. And then from there, exporting it into like a CSV file where you're probably going to look into some auditing, some reporting. And then second, you have the LGPO tool. So that's where it's again allowing you to verify the effect of the group policy settings on that local host, like the really local machine group policy setting involvement, validating if anything is off standard compared to what the Microsoft product teams are recommending to have in place. And with that, you can imagine that I got yet another demo coming up where I'm quickly going to show you what that Security Compliance Toolkit is about, where you can find it on the Microsoft website, integrating the policy analyzer, and then also showing you what that local group policy tool actually looks like. So this next demo starts with downloading the Microsoft Security Compliance Toolkit. You could use the link up here. So if you go to the Microsoft download site and you provide ID 55319, you're going to end up straight away, or obviously using your search engine. From there, you click download, and it's going to give you a whole bunch of options. But the one we'd like to highlight out of this topic is the LGPO, that's Local Group Policy Management Tool. You're going to scroll down a little bit. You're going to find Policy Analyzer. And then all the way down, we're going to grab the latest Windows Server 2025 security baseline. So you select them, you do download, and then once you download it, all these items, you can see it's just a collection of zip files. So we're going to extract them. And then one of the first ones I'll show you is LGPO. So that's a command line tool where I'm not going to do much with it, but let me show you what we have inside the zip file. So you could read through the PDF document. I would always recommend you that. And then from there, you could run LGPO, and just gonna make this a little bit bigger, and then I can show you a bit what the use case for this tool could look like. So it's gonna allow you, in short, to export policy settings, import policy settings, or also parsing an actual registry policy file into a text file. So pretty convenient, I would say, for maybe monitoring, maybe troubleshooting, or just getting more up to date on what policies look like. There's way many more options that I'm walking you through here, so keep that in mind. The other interesting tool we have is Policy Analyzer. So that's going to allow you to literally analyze policies. So the way it works is you open up your Policy Analyzer and it's going to ask you using add, it's going to ask you to import, where you can see up here, you have a few different options. So also see that interaction with the registry.pol, where maybe the LGPO could be used to create that. You can add files from a GPO as well. That's what I did. And then it's going to ask you to browse to your policy locations where you store the GPO, which could be technically the sysfile on a domain controller. Once you've done that, you have the actual policy file here, and then you can start comparing them. So you could do a previous state, new state. And this is, for example, the policy that I used in one of my previous demos, how to enable device guard. And it's going to show you like all the details. So that's another pretty convenient tool, mainly comparing changes in policies. Last option I want to show you is the actual security baseline. So what we find in here is, again, a set of group policy objects, actual templates that you can import. And I would recommend you to maybe start with the group policy reports. So if I grab my domain controller policy for server 2025, it's going to show me like all possible settings, which ones are enabled, which ones are disabled, specifically for server 25 domain controllers. If you go to your group policy management console, you can create a new policy. That's what I did here. And then instead of editing, you would now import settings, click next, pointing to the folder where you want to grab them. And then from there, it's going to import the policy files that you downloaded out of that security baseline. And then obviously from here, you would dive into all the settings and then looping through all the changes. But that's what the report would, again, also be quite beneficial. So that's, I would say, pretty much it on the group policy management, but then importing the baseline as well as the LGPO and policy analyzer. Let's go back to the presentation. Good. With that, we're close to, I would say, going through that super long list of security optimization settings for your Windows server. We're close to the end of this section, but we're not 100% done yet. Last one I need to touch on here is securing SMB traffic. So first, what is SMB? It's the server messaging block, which means it's the protocol that you're going to use for file sharing. You might know it as CIFS on like a Linux or Unix or maybe even your Mac operating system. So what it allows you to do is, after a user is authenticated out of like Active Directory, and if it's not a domain joined client, then it's still using that local machine authentication. From there, the user, you could say, tries to use a file sharing protocol. Copying files, connecting files, migrating files, that's really what we're doing. Now you need to open up some validation, some network traffic ports to allow SMB traffic. And as you can see, it's nothing new. It's been around for, again, more than 25 years. And that's where now we end up with version 3.1.1. Ultimately, I would say try to move up to the latest, most recent version. Now, there are also some constraints where, depending again on the version of your operating system, client and server, incoming and outgoing, like connecting from a client to a server, but then also maybe having some traffic coming back. There's so many dependencies on this, but ultimately, if you look in all those details, are we able to disable it, or can we move up to the latest version? That would be the ultimate security recommendation. That's mainly what this is about. And then we also have an item here on the pre-authentication integrity. Now, what does it mean? Like I mentioned before, let's say you have a client connecting to a server file share, maybe copying files, accessing files from the file share. There's some handshake going on. So what it means is that you got the negotiation going on, you got the session setup, as we call it, going on, and that's where the SMB encryption is obviously the big difference between the older SMB protocol version and the latest 3.1.1. So a couple of improvements here without, again, not reading from the slides, but overall SMB encryption on its own got improved. Cluster upgrade support if you want to move your high available clusters, which by the way is another module in our AZ-801 here that I'll talk about later on. If you want to do rolling cluster upgrades, which means from an existing cluster, in place upgrading your cluster, or maybe moving to another workstation and server setup for your clustered environment, there's a lot of SMB traffic going back and forth, and that's where now it's also being supported in that latest version. So that's mainly what we wanted to highlight here. Got a few screenshots on how to actually manage it. This is Windows Admin Center that I'll show you later on in my upcoming demo. You don't need Windows Admin Center to manage all this. So that's where I would say just keep that in mind. You can use this using PowerShell. As always, you can define all these using group policies. I'll show you in the demo what it looks like out of PowerShell, and then also how you can define all those settings, moving up to the latest, most secured version of the SMB protocol and corresponding settings using that Windows Admin Center. Good, and with that, we're more than halfway in our module here, but there's one last section I need to cover, and that's update management for your Windows Server environment. Probably no real surprise here what you're going to learn, but we're going to start with exploring what is Windows Update about, and then obviously outlining how to get that service up and running, how to actually start using it, and really managing the whole process of your server, and yes, if you want clients, and not just the operating system layer, but there are a few other updates that you could enable as well. And that's what we're mainly going to talk about. Now, before going into quite some detail here, I also need to get your attention to the fact that officially the Windows Software Update Service, or WSS as we like to call it, is officially deprecated. Now you might go like, okay, deprecated typically means like it's no longer supported. Now the interesting part here is that because your Windows updates are so crucial, it is actually still supported. Now the deprecated piece means that the platform, that's how I describe it, the platform, again, it's like a 15-year-old tool, but it's still working and it's still doing a really good job, but it's not getting updated anymore. I could almost say that it's so good, so stable, that it actually works that brilliant, that the version doesn't really need to be changed anymore. And it's not really about the managing aspect or the interfacing. It's really about what can it actually do for my servers. And that's, I would say, the highlight that I want to talk about for a little bit. So in short, what is Windows Update? Like any device you have, maybe even your microwave at home, every now and then you need to patch it, right? Patching means we have bug fixes. It means we got security fixes. It means we got performance stability fixes. And the recommendation is always try to install all those updates as fast as possible. I could send a little side note into your direction on this, like don't just deploy them in your production environment, but make sure that you can test your impact of potential updates in like a dev and test environment. Now we're talking about Windows Server here, we're talking about Windows updates, but it's valid for clients. And as you can see, it's valid for security patches, but also overall application component updates, even depending a bit on the devices itself. It could also update your firmware. So think of the WSS as a centralized management environment for all those updates, where in short, just a diagram here, what it looks like, you have, again, you can see it on the left-hand side, test clients. Interesting enough, there's no test server here, but that could mean that you're going to deploy 2 instances of the WSS environment. Totally isolated testing environment with server and clients, and then gradually installing the patching updates for as much as possible, as closely reflecting your production environments. That would obviously be the guideline. And then from there, replicating the same into your actual production environment. So in short, how does it work? Let me just highlight a few things on the diagram. So we start with the test clients. Could be at least one version of each and every client or server operating system, preferably with a lot of applications because sometimes it might impact applications if you install some update. Next to that, we have automatic updates, where it means it's connecting to a WSUS update service backend running in the Microsoft environment. And you're going to manage all that using an update website. So you could basically go to a public website, looking through all the potential updates for your environment. And that's also partly what that WSUS server right here in the middle is doing for you. You can deploy it as a single server, like in this example, but it's more like a topology diagram. But nothing blocks you from like load balancing it, but also making it more high available. So that's a bit what you see here. Single WSUS. It's always good to have one, but it's always better to have more than one. You could deploy these in different environments, like across different branch office locations, maybe keeping one main WSUS server in your environment, and then from there, building out a topology that only one WSUS server is connecting to that public backend Microsoft service, downloading, pulling in all the updates, and then from there spreading them across the network. Another really interesting one is the disconnected WSUS. So what this means is that you're going to deploy WSUS, but it's not connected all the time to the internet, or maybe not even to the internet if you use that internal synchronization. But you could actually go as far as copying offline. So you download all the updates. They're stored on the prime WSUS or maybe one of the other WSUS servers on the network. You're going to copy all the update files because in the end, it's all part of the file system. You're going to copy the file share. You're going to copy all the data. And then manually, I would say, maybe copying them over using like an offline USB stick, why not, and patching all the other servers. And then building out a full server hierarchy for the more complex scenarios, where again, it means that you would have that internet-facing, update service-facing WSUS server, and then defining that on the lower level, we're going to deploy more WSUS servers, not just across the different endpoints in the network, like different branch offices, but creating like a hierarchy where one WSUS might be responsible for firmware updates, another one might be responsible for traditional operating system updates, and then allowing the clients to move around and connecting to different ones. So actually a pretty brilliant solution, pretty powerful, but again, keep in mind that it's losing a little bit of its power because it's not really being updated anymore. But the update again points to the whole mechanism, the topology, the concept, but obviously it still pulls in the latest and greatest patches and updates that you need. If you want to implement this or you already have it, but you want to learn a little bit more, as always, it starts with auditing assessment. This means know what your device, server, and client environment looks like. What it means is if you don't have Windows 7, if you don't have Windows 8, if you don't have Windows 10 anymore, then make sure that you're not downloading, bringing in any of those patches into your environment. So that's running your assessment, scanning the network, knowing what it's running. Next to that, identify. That means zooming in, looking in a little bit more specific. Out of all the updates that we do have available out of the service, which ones are we installing? Which ones do we need? That's where step 3 evaluation comes in, running it on a test environment preferably, and then eventually pushing it out to your production environments. Keep in mind that some of those updates, actually quite a lot of them, are still requiring reboots. That's where you need to think about not only how to download the updates, but also how you're going to bring them into your client and server environment. Next to that, you might also have some computers, some devices not detecting WSUS integration. You could have a WSUS server running out of disk space, like there's some cleanup task needed, because if you download like every update over the last 25 years in the WSUS history, you probably don't need all that information. So make sure that your server is like not running out of storage capacity, which might actually end up in the service no longer running. It could become a bottleneck. It could become a risk for the high availability of the service itself. And that's mainly what I wanted to zoom in on this. And with that, I also like to wrap up this module where, remember, it was all about securing Windows Server on premises primarily, but then also the little lean into hybrid, because that's really what AZ-801 is about. But for this module, we mainly touched on Windows Server security, managing, protecting the security optimization of the server operating system, where we started a long time ago, securing Windows Server user accounts, some guidelines, best practices. Second topic was hardening that Windows Server operating system with a lot of Defender capabilities, and then also bringing in that compliance toolkit. And then last, how to protect your servers by installing the latest patches, the latest updates using WSUS Server. This is the end of this specific module, where first of all, I hope you learned new things. And if you have been managing Windows Server environments for quite a while, I still hope that you picked up some new things, or maybe a good refresh or a recap on some of your day-to-day administration, where you might not always touch on all those specifics. And apart from that, I hope I can invite you to join me to our next module, where we continue talking about server security, but this time looking at it a little bit more from an Azure hybrid perspective. Thank you for now, and see you again soon in one of my other modules.